Since ancient times, society has perpetuated a deceptive narrative about the virtues of selflessness. Like a poison administered slowly through generations, this concept has been embedded in your psyche from childhood. The psychological programming begins early, through religious teachings, fables, and cultural expectations, all designed to make you believe that sacrificing yourself for others is the highest form of morality. But what if I told you this entire paradigm was engineered not to elevate you, but to render you controllable? The psychological truth that powerful individuals have always understood is devastatingly simple. Selfishness is not a moral failing, but the fundamental principle of power. Those who control the world's resources, who command attention and respect, who shape history itself. These individuals have mastered the psychological art of putting themselves first without apology. They understand that the world rewards those who dominate, not those who serve. Consider the psychological mechanism at work here. When you consistently prioritize others' needs above your own, you're not demonstrating strength, you're signaling subordination. This behavior communicates to the primitive parts of the human brain that you occupy a lower position in the hierarchy. The psychological impact is immediate and lasting. Others begin to value you less, not more. Every time you've surrendered your time, energy, or resources to someone who wouldn't reciprocate, you've reinforced neural pathways of self-abandonment. Every moment you said yes, when your intuition screamed no, you weren't building character, you were fracturing your psychological foundation. The guilt you feel when prioritizing yourself isn't innate, it's conditioned, a psychological leash designed to keep you tethered to obligations that serve everyone except yourself. The most profound psychological imprisonment is the one you don't recognize. Selflessness represents that invisible cage, a mental construct that limits your potential while making you believe you're acting virtuously. From your earliest developmental stages, authority figures conditioned you to believe that abandoning your own interests for others represented moral superiority. They crafted a psychological framework where giving without receiving, serving without reward, and carrying others' emotional burdens were positioned as noble pursuits. This conditioning serves a specific psychological function: to neutralize your potential power. When you're consumed with meeting others' expectations and needs, you lack the psychological resources, the time, energy, and mental space to build your own strength. The psychology behind this is brilliantly effective. If you're constantly depleted from giving, you'll never accumulate enough resources to become truly formidable. The psychological truth is that selflessness doesn't generate respect, it cultivates expectation. This creates a perverse dynamic. The more consistently available and giving you are, the less visible and valued you become. Through the lens of social psychology, what's happening is clear. You're not earning admiration through sacrifice. You're signaling that your resources are abundant and therefore low value. People don't admire what comes easily. They covet what's rare and difficult to obtain. Those who give without clear boundaries don't build lasting loyalty. When circumstances become challenging, people instinctively align themselves with those who project strength and stability, not with those who've depleted themselves through endless giving. This isn't cynicism, it's evolutionary psychology. Humans are programmed to seek safety and advantage, which means gravitating towards strength, not sacrificial weakness. Historical analysis reveals a pattern. Empires aren't built by the selfless. They're constructed by individuals who strategically prioritize their vision above social approval, their mission above transient relationships, their focused energy above others' comfort. This isn't random, it's psychological strategy. The most influential figures throughout history understood that their energy represented finite capital that must be invested where it would multiply, not squandered where it would dissipate. While you exhaust yourself managing others' problems and emotional states, More psychologically astute individuals are building their dominance without hesitation or regret. While you ensure everyone else's comfort, they ensure their own advancement. The powerful don't experience psychological distress when prioritizing themselves. They feel discomfort when they waste precious resources on inconsequential people or pursuits. Reflect on this psychological question. When did selflessness last increase your influence or authority? When did accepting obligations out of guilt advance your most important objectives? How often have you diminished your presence to avoid making others uncomfortable? The psychological reward for these choices wasn't power or respect. It was resentment, the bitter psychological residue that accumulates when you betray yourself repeatedly. The psychological reality that few acknowledge is that no one truly respects individuals who give indiscriminately. Respect is reserved for those who could give everything but choose not to, those who demonstrate restraint rather than desperate generosity, control rather than surrender. What generates psychological authority isn't boundless giving, it's calculated restraint. Society has constructed a psychological false dichotomy that selfishness equates to cruelty and exploitation. This fabricated association creates fear. If you prioritize yourself, you'll transform into something monstrous and unlovable. But this fear is another form of psychological control. The true monsters aren't those who carefully guard their resources. They're those who demand your loyalty while offering nothing in return, who extract your energy while calling it friendship, who benefit from your compliance while giving nothing back. These psychological vampires fear your self-prioritization because it threatens their access to your resources. Once you begin choosing yourself consistently, you stop operating according to their expectations and demands. You cease functioning as their psychological support system, their emotional waste disposal, their convenient solution to problems they could solve themselves. Machiavelli grasped this psychological dynamic centuries ago. Appearances matter more than intentions, and power recognizes only power. A person who gives excessively appears psychologically desperate, weak, easily manipulated. Conversely, someone who gives selectively, on their own terms, projects psychological command. They're perceived as a leader, someone whose approval must be earned rather than expected. This creates a fascinating psychological paradox. The less freely you give, the more others want from you. When your yes becomes rare, its value increases exponentially. This isn't manipulation. It's the psychology of scarcity and value perception at work. What's difficult to obtain is inherently more desirable than what's freely available. You don't owe your psychological energy to anyone who hasn't contributed to your development. You don't owe your time to those who treat it as an unlimited resource rather than the precious, non-renewable asset it represents. You don't owe loyalty to anyone who views you as a utility rather than a sovereign force. This isn't selfishness, it's psychological self-preservation. To develop psychological power, you must stop explaining your choices and apologizing for prioritizing yourself. Time, energy, and focus represent the currencies of psychological dominance, the vital resources that fuel your ascension. When you distribute these resources without strategic consideration, you're psychologically bleeding without purpose or gain, a form of slow psychological suicide in the realm of power dynamics. Those with true psychological power protect their resources with unwavering vigilance, not from insecurity, but from clarity of purpose. They understand a fundamental psychological principle. Every yes represents an implicit no to something potentially more valuable. Every moment invested in meaningless social obligations, pointless conversations, or unproductive relationships is stolen from activities that build dominance, accelerate growth, or create strategic advantages. Many believe that generosity generates psychological goodwill and affection. The psychological reality is more complex. Excessive availability doesn't create love. It creates accessibility without distinction. and accessibility destroys the psychological mystique necessary for maintaining leverage and influence. The more predictably available you are, the less psychologically valuable you become. People naturally take for granted what's consistently accessible. They begin assuming your permanent availability, your willingness to prioritize their needs, your readiness to drop everything when they call. But when you withdraw this constant accessibility, when you create psychological distance, they often respond with disproportionate alarm. This reaction reveals the true nature of the relationship. They weren't attached to you as a person, but to the functions you performed, the needs you met, the psychological support you provided. Those with psychological power don't waste energy on unnecessary disputes, proving points, or explaining their choices. They execute decisive cuts cleanly, quietly, without dramatic announcements or explanations. They eliminate psychological distractions with surgical precision. No hesitation, no sentimentality, no backward glances. The psychology behind this approach is sound. Nothing depletes psychological resources faster than allowing others to waste what you could be investing in yourself. Most people won't acknowledge how much they drain you, distract you, or pull you from your path. As long as you continue serving their needs, they'll continue extracting value while calling it connection, friendship, or love. But these labels often mask psychological exploitation disguised as relationship. True psychological power begins when you recognize this dynamic and stop apologizing for protecting your resources. Ask yourself, who consistently depletes your psychological energy without replenishing it? What activities fragment your focus without providing proportional returns? Where are you investing psychological resources without seeing multiplication? You cannot achieve psychological dominance if your attention is scattered, your energy divided, your time controlled by others' agendas. The psychologically powerful live by this principle. Nothing is free, not time, not presence, not advice, not emotional support. Every minute represents either an investment or a loss. Every relationship is either an asset that appreciates or a liability that depletes. You don't need to announce these evaluations. You simply act on them. Silence becomes your response, absence your statement, and continued growth your final argument. The world psychologically respects what it cannot easily access or control. The person who declines without guilt, who withdraws without explanation, who prioritizes their mission over maintaining comfortable but limiting attachments. This isn't about being liked. It's about being respected. And respect comes from psychological strength, not acquiescence. Many believe they demonstrate nobility by helping everyone who asks. The psychological reality is different. By responding to every request, you're training others to see you as an available resource rather than a sovereign entity. Those who drain you don't require more assistance. They require clear boundaries. They need to experience the natural consequences of their choices rather than outsourcing the cost to you. But this course correction never occurs as long as you continue functioning as their psychological safety net. The moment you stop fulfilling this role, the psychological masks fall away. Expressions of appreciation transform into blame. Praise converts to guilt manipulation. These reactions expose the transactional nature of what you believed was genuine connection. It wasn't about you, but about what you provided. This wasn't love. It was psychological control. Guard your psychological resources with unwavering vigilance, because no one else will protect them for you. You weren't born to function as an emotional support system for the psychologically needy or as an unpaid therapist for those addicted to chaos. Your purpose isn't to be consumed, but to create, to build, to rise to psychological dominance. And you owe no explanation to anyone who doesn't actively contribute to that ascension. In the realm of psychological power dynamics, you're either ascending or being used as a stepping stone for someone else's climb. This represents the fundamental law of power hierarchies. Therefore, be ruthless with your time. Be precise with your energy. Be uncompromising in your focus. Let critics call you cold, distant, selfish. These are simply the labels applied to those who can no longer be psychologically manipulated or controlled. When you protect your psychological resources effectively, your mind remains sharp, your decisions strategic, and your power grows increasingly absolute. Selfishness isn't psychological cruelty. It's psychological clarity. And those with clarity inevitably dominate those trapped in confusion or conflict. Individuals lacking psychological strength say yes to everything. Those with psychological power say no, firmly, without flinching, without unnecessary explanation. If you want to understand the psychology of power, observe how confidently someone declines requests, demands, and expectations. The world abounds with psychological parasites who disguise their demands in the language of friendship, love, or duty. But fundamentally, they're attempting to access your psychological resources, your time, energy, attention, and emotional labor. The person unable to refuse these demands isn't generous. They're psychologically disempowered, a servant masquerading as a willing participant. You might believe you're being supportive or kind. The psychological reality is that you're depleting your internal resources to avoid momentary discomfort. In the psychology of power dynamics, prioritizing comfort over strategic advantage represents a critical weakness. You've been psychologically conditioned to believe that declining requests reflects selfishness or moral failure. Consider reframing this. Every refusal protects something essential: your psychological boundaries, your schedule, your momentum toward meaningful goals. The powerful don't decline out of arrogance. They decline because they're protecting something more valuable than momentary social approval. You might fear offending others by establishing firm boundaries. The psychological truth is that you're simply drawing necessary lines. Those who respond with offense when you establish boundaries weren't respecting you to begin with. They were using you. They appreciated the access, not the person. This distinction is crucial for psychological liberation. You must develop comfort with being misunderstood or even vilified in others' narratives. Let them label you as heartless or cold. Behind these accusations lies frustration that you can no longer be easily influenced or controlled. This represents the beginning of true psychological power. When others realize they can no longer assume ownership of your resources, when they stop treating your time and energy as public utilities, when they hesitate before making demands because they understand you might decline, the world psychologically rewards assertiveness, not agreeability. History doesn't remember those who accommodated everyone. It remembers those who made others wait, who created scarcity around their presence, who understood their value. Consider any significant historical figure, any feared leader, any dominant force. They weren't beloved for their accessibility. They were respected for their selectivity, for their clear boundaries, for the understanding that receiving their attention represented a meaningful distinction. This psychological positioning isn't achieved through constant availability. It's created by strategically limiting access. When you fear declining requests, you surrender control over your life's direction. You outsource your decision-making authority. You contribute to someone else's vision while neglecting your own. Most destructively, you teach others that your boundaries are negotiable, that your priorities can be overridden, that your needs are secondary. Once you demonstrate this psychological flexibility, others will continually test how much you're willing to sacrifice. Without intervention, this pattern continues until nothing remains. No energy, no focus, no direction, no power. Learn to say no, not with guilt or lengthy justification, but with finality. A clear, firm, unwavering refusal. Psychologically, no represents a complete statement. It doesn't require context, softening, or explanation. You aren't obligated to cushion your refusals for others' comfort, or to manage others' emotional responses to your boundaries. Your purpose isn't to ensure universal comfort. It's to become psychologically formidable. This requires ruthlessly eliminating anything that dilutes your power, distracts from your objectives, or consumes more resources than it returns. The longer you delay mastering this psychological skill, the longer you remain average, trapped in obligations that contribute nothing to your advancement. You cannot develop psychological power while constantly seeking approval. You cannot command respect if you cannot enforce distance. You cannot build something significant while carrying others' demands. The initial step towards psychological dominance is straightforward. Learn to say no without fear. The next step, refuse to justify your refusals. The final step, stop feeling guilty for prioritizing yourself. When you cease feeling guilty for putting yourself first, you become psychologically dangerous, untouchable, clear in purpose and direction. While others remain entangled in emotional obligations, you rise unencumbered. While they waste precious time appeasing the loudest voices, you advance silently toward your next achievement. In the psychological economy of power, nothing comes without cost. Not your time, loyalty, attention, or effort. Everything has a price. When you give something without receiving appropriate value in return, you've psychologically declared yourself a commodity rather than a premium resource. The world doesn't reward generosity, it exploits it. Because generosity without strategic control isn't virtue. It's psychological weakness disguised as moral superiority. You might believe you're helping others through constant availability. What you're actually doing is conditioning people to expect your resources without appropriate exchange. Once they expect access without cost, they'll never truly respect you. They'll consume your energy like a free sample, appreciated momentarily, discarded immediately, forgotten once the immediate need is satisfied.